Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you, the grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. Tammy Isaac, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. Now back to our show. Today I want to talk about what was never mourned, particularly within the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Now, there are losses that we know how to recognize as grief. You know, someone dies, people gather, a funeral is held, and then there is an understanding that mourning should follow. But ask yourself, what happens when the loss is connected to something a family, a culture, or an entire community has been expected to survive without ever being given the opportunity to grieve? Now, within the BIPOC communities, there are histories of loss that have often been discussed in terms of injustice, racism, oppression, migration, displacement, or survival. Those words are important, but there is another word that belongs in the conversation, and that is grief. Because when people lose land and safety, culture, traditions, family connections, or opportunities, trust, or a sense of belonging, something has been lost. And whenever there is a meaningful loss, there is the possibility of grief. But grief requires somewhere to go. It requires enough safety to acknowledge what hurts. It requires people who are willing to witness the pain. It requires language, time, and space. And for generations, many people of color did not have those conditions. Survival took priority. Families kept moving, communities adapted, and people learned how to function because functioning was necessary. But surviving something does not mean there is nothing to be mourned. And I think that is where this conversation becomes important. I'm not interested in telling a story about BIPOC communities that is only about suffering. Our cultures are also filled with joy, faith, creativity, wisdom, celebration, family, tradition, and community. But honoring those things does not require us to ignore what hurt. We can celebrate what our communities carried forward while also asking what they never had the opportunity to lay down. So, in this episode, I want to explore the grief beneath some of that silence. I want to talk about what happens when survival leaves little room for mourning, how that silence can move through families and generations, and why loneliness can develop when people carry pain that has never been witnessed. Because sometimes what we call strength has a story underneath it. Sometimes what we call silence has a story underneath it. And sometimes when we listen closely enough to those stories, we discover grief that has been waiting a very long time to be named. Now let's take a deep breath and let's dig in. When I use the phrase unmourned grief, I am talking about grief that was never given the conditions necessary for mourning. The loss happened, the pain was real. Something changed, something was taken, interrupted, or left behind, but there was no real opportunity to stop and acknowledge what it meant. There was no language for it, no safe place to express it, and sometimes no one willing to witness it. And that is what makes grief unmourned. It is not the absence of grief, it is the grief that had nowhere to go. For many BIPOC communities, this matters because so much of our history has required survival before reflection. People had to keep moving, families had to adapt, communities had to figure out how to live inside systems that did not always protect them, value them, or make room for their pain. And when survival becomes the priority, mourning can get pushed aside, not because the loss was unimportant, but because there was no room to stop. I think this is important because we often confuse endurance with healing. We look at a family that kept going or a community that continued to build and worship, work and raise children, create and organize and survive. And we assume that because they made it through, the pain must have been resolved. But survival tells us that people found a way to continue. It does not tell us what they had to carry in order to do it. That distinction matters when we think about BIPOC grief. There are losses that were never publicly recognized as losses. There are experiences that were treated as simply part of life, part of history, or part of what people had to endure. But when something meaningful is taken from a person or a community, there is grief attached to that loss, whether anyone names it or not. And sometimes the first act of mourning is simply naming what happened differently. Instead of saying this is just what our people went through, we begin to ask, what did that cost us? Instead of only talking about what people overcame, we can ask what they were never given the chance to grieve. That question opens up a different kind of conversation because it allows us to honor strength without using strength to silence pain. That is where I want us to stay for a moment. Unmourned grief is not about weakness. It is not about suggesting that BIPOC communities are defined by suffering. It is about recognizing that strength and sorrow have often existed side by side. A community can be strong and still be grieving. A family can survive and still carry pain. A person can continue functioning and still have losses that were never fully acknowledged. And when that grief remains unnamed for long enough, it does not always disappear. Sometimes it becomes part of the way a family learns to communicate. Sometimes it shapes what people believe they are allowed to feel. And sometimes it influences what is spoken and what is kept quiet. This is where we're going next, because if we want to understand unmourned grief in BIPOC communities, we also have to understand why so much of that grief was never given room to be expressed in the first place. If unmourned grief is grief that never had somewhere to go, then we have to ask the next question. Why was there no room for it? For many BIPOC communities, the answer is tied to survival. Mourning requires certain conditions. It requires safety. It requires time. It requires enough support to be able to stop and feel what has happened. But when people are trying to survive racism, poverty, displacement, violence, family separation, or exclusion from systems that are supposed to help them, grief often becomes secondary to the immediate need to keep going. That does not mean the grief was absent. It means there was often no safe place to express it. If you are worried about where you are going to live, whether your family is safe, whether you will be treated fairly, or whether speaking honestly will create more danger, then mourning can feel like a luxury. The body may be carrying sorrow, but life is demanding action. There are bills that need to be paid, children to raise, jobs to keep, communities to protect, and problems that cannot wait. This is one of the reasons silence can become so deeply rooted in families and communities. Silence may begin as protection. It can become a way of holding things together when there is no other support available. A family may decide that certain things are not discussed because talking about them feels dangerous. A community may also learn not to trust certain institutions because those institutions have caused harm or failed to respond when help was needed. And over time, those survivor responses can become culture or family rules, even after the original circumstance has changed. And this is where generational patterns begin to matter. What protected one generation can become a burden for the next. A parent who taught that vulnerability was dangerous may teach a child to stay strong. A family that learned to keep pain private may continue doing so because that is what has always felt safe. A community that has experienced repeated dismissal may stop expecting anyone to listen. And the silence then gets passed forward, sometimes without anyone fully understanding where it began. And this is why we have to be careful not to judge the silence too quickly. It's easy to say, why did they not talk about it? Or why did they not ask for help? But those questions ignore the context, okay? Was it safe to speak? Would anyone have believed them? Was help actually available? Would asking for help have created more harm? Those are questions that matter because silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes silence is what people learn to use in order to survive. And the problem is that survival strategies can continue long after they are actually needed. What once protected a family can later make emotional connection more difficult. What once helped a community endure can later make it harder to ask for support. The silence that kept people safe can eventually become the very thing that keeps grief isolated. And when grief stays isolated, people can begin to believe that they are supposed to carry it alone. That is where silence starts to turn into loneliness. So in the next segment, I want to talk about what happens when grief is present, but no one feels safe enough to name it, share it, or have it witnessed. When grief has no safe place to be expressed, silence can begin to feel normal. People learn how to carry pain quietly. Families learn how to function around what no one wants to name. And communities learn how to keep moving without ever stopping to ask what all of that survival has done emotionally. And then over time, that silence can become loneliness. Now, loneliness is not simply about being alone, okay? A person can be surrounded by family, friends, and coworkers, church members in their community and still feel unseen. The loneliness comes from carrying something that no one seems to recognize. It comes from believing that the full story is too much, too complicated, too painful, or too uncomfortable for other people to hear. And for many BIPOC communities, this kind of loneliness can be connected to the experience of having pain repeatedly misunderstood or minimized. When people have learned that they may not be believed, that their experiences may be questioned, or that speaking honestly may create conflict, they often become more careful about what they share. And silence can begin to feel safer than that vulnerability. But the cost of that silence can be very significant. When grief is never witnessed, a person can begin to feel as though they are carrying it by themselves. And they may not need someone to fix what happened. They may not even need someone to fully understand it, but they do need to know that their pain matters and that someone is willing to remain present with them in it. That is where the idea of witness becomes important. To witness grief is not to explain it away. It is not to rush someone toward healing. It is not to compare their experiences with someone else's. It is simply to acknowledge that something happened, that something was lost, and that the loss deserves to be recognized. For communities that have often had to defend their experiences, being witnessed can be very powerful. It communicates that the person does not have to prove that their grief is real. They do not have to make it more acceptable because it can be heard. They do not have to translate their pain into language that makes everyone else feel comfortable. And I think this is where loneliness and grief become connected. Grief becomes heavier when it has no witness. It becomes more isolating when the person believes they are the only one carrying it. The pain itself may not disappear simply because someone listens, but being heard changes the experience of carrying it. And this is why presence matters. And sometimes the most meaningful support is not advice. It is not answers. It is not even the perfect words. It is the willingness to stay. It is the willingness to say, in one way or another, I see what you are carrying and I'm not going to look away. Now, that kind of presence can definitely interrupt loneliness. It can create room for grief to move from silence into relationship. And once grief has witness, something begins to change. The person is no longer carrying the story entirely alone. And that brings us to the next part of this conversation, because if silence can deepen loneliness, then permission and connection may be part of what helps people begin to mourn what was never mourned. If silence can deepen loneliness, then permission can begin to create another way forward. Permission does not erase what happened, and it does not undo history, restore every loss, or make pain disappear. What permission does is create space for grief to be acknowledged without shame. It gives people room to say, this hurt me, this changed me, and this matters. Now, for our BIPOC communities, permission can be especially important because so much grief has been carried in environments where survival was valued more than emotional expression. People learned how to keep moving because they had to. They learned how to stay composed because the world did not always feel safe enough for vulnerability. And over time, that can create the belief that grief must remain private, or that speaking about pain somehow dishonors the strength of those who came before us. Now, I want to share this scene from a movie, and I'm sharing this because my book, Let the Church Grieve, one of the premise of that basically is about people being given permission to breathe. And somebody said, you don't need permission to grieve. And I thought, how privileged of that is of you to say, when you are not a part of a BIPOC community that had to suffer some of the things that we went through. And there's a misunderstanding of what permission means. But I think this scene that I'm going to share with you gives us a clear idea of what I mean when we talk about permission. Okay. So there is a scene from the Shawshank Redemption that I often think about when I talk about permission. Red, who is played by Morgan Freeman, has spent decades incarcerated. And when he is finally released, he then gets a job at a grocery store. And at one point, he goes to his manager and he asks for permission to use the restroom. And he's like, bathroom break, boss. And then his manager calls him over and essentially tells him that, hey, you don't have to ask me every time you need to go to the bathroom, right? He said, just go. Red is no longer in prison, but Red has lived under confinement for so long that even though he is physically free, part of him is still operating by the rules of the place that he left behind. And you see him go into the restroom in the scene, and he tells himself, you know, for 30, 40 years, I've been asking for permission to go to the restroom. And he said, I can't take one drop. I can't go to the restroom without asking for permission. He's been conditioned. That scene has always stayed with me because it shows us that freedom is not only about where your body is located. Sometimes the environment changes before the person knows how to live differently inside of it. And Red had been released, but he was still learning that he no longer needed someone else's permission for something as basic as going to the restroom. The prison was no longer around him in the same way, but some of the prison was still living in his habits, in his responses, and his understanding of what he was allowed to do. And I think there is something in that for this conversation about mourning, unmourned grief. Many people in BIPOC communities have inherited messages about what they are allowed to feel, what they are allowed to say, how much space they are allowed to take up, and whether they are allowed to stop long enough to grieve. The circumstances may have changed, but the old rules remain. Be strong. Keep it together. Do not talk about family business. Do not let them see you hurting. Do not make anyone uncomfortable. Keep going, right? And at some point, permission has to be reclaimed. Not permission from somebody else to decide whether our grief is legitimate, but the permission we give ourselves to acknowledge that something hurt, something was lost, and something still deserves to be mourned. Sometimes people are technically free to feel, but they have spent so long learning not to, that the freedom itself has to be practiced. That is why acknowledging grief does not dishonor strength. In many ways, it gives strength a fuller story. It allows us to say that our ancestors, our families, and our communities endured extraordinary things, and that endurance had a cost. It allows us to honor what was survived without pretending that survival came without sorrow. Permission also changes the relationship people have with their own emotions. When grief has been silenced for a long time, people can begin to judge themselves for what they feel. They may believe they should have moved past something by now, or that acknowledging their old wound means that they are somehow moving backwards. And permission interrupts that judgment. It says that grief does not have to fit someone else's timetable in order to be real. And permission can happen collectively as well. Some grief is larger than one person. It belongs to families and communities. When that grief is acknowledged together, people no longer have to carry it as though it was only an individual burden. The story can be remembered. The loss can be named. People can begin to say, this happened to us. And we are allowed to talk about what it cost us. That does not mean everyone has to mourn in the same way. BIPOC communities are not one culture. And there is no single expression of grief that fits every family or every tradition. What matters is creating enough room for people to mourn without being forced back into the silence that taught them they needed permission in the first place. That is what I take from Red's story. Sometimes the door is already open, but you have lived behind it for so long that you are still waiting for somebody to tell you that you can walk through. And part of healing is beginning to recognize that you no longer have to ask permission to acknowledge your own pain. You are allowed to name what happened. You are allowed to acknowledge what it cost you, and you are allowed to grieve what was never mourned. When we talk about permission to grieve, we cannot place the entire responsibility on the individual. Sometimes people have not given themselves permission because the systems around them have repeatedly communicated that their grief does not matter. Society has not always made room. Governments have not always made room. Healthcare systems have not always made room. Schools and workplaces, faith communities, and other institutions have not always made room. And in many cases, BIPOC communities have been expected to carry pain while remaining functional inside systems that continue to push them to the margins. That matters because grief does not happen outside of social conditions. People grieve inside institutions. They grieve inside workplaces that may not offer enough time to mourn. They grieve inside healthcare systems where they may already feel dismissed or mistrusted. They grieve inside communities where their losses may be treated as less urgent, less visible, or less worthy of attention. And when those systems fail to recognize the grief. The person is left trying to mourn in an environment that does not fully acknowledge what happened. Healthcare is one of the clearest examples of this. If a community has a history of being mistreated, ignored, untreated, or harmed within healthcare, that history does not disappear when someone enters a hospital or clinic. The grief can already be present before the current medical crisis began. There may be grief connected to previous experiences, to distrust, to feeling unheard, or to watching loved ones struggle to receive equitable care. And when those experiences are not acknowledged, healthcare can become another place where grief is pushed aside instead of witnessed. The same can happen at the level of government and political or public policy, right? Decisions about housing and education, incarceration, immigration, access to care, employment, and community safety have emotional consequences. When people are repeatedly affected by policies that disrupt families, limit opportunities, or create instability, there is loss attached to those experiences. Yet the public conversation often focuses on the policy itself without asking what people have had to grieve because of it. This is why I think permission can only sound like give yourself permission to grieve. This is why I don't think permission can only sound like give yourself permission to breathe. Sometimes the more important question is whether the environment is creating any room for grief at all. Are people safe enough to speak? Are they believed when they do? Are their losses acknowledged? Are they given time to mourn? I mean, are they treated with dignity when they bring their pain into the room? And if the answer is no, then we have to be willing to say that the problem is not only personal. Sometimes the environment is participating in the silence. And this is one of the ways marginalization continues. It is not only about being excluded from opportunity, but it is also about whose pain receives attention, whose grief is publicly recognized, whose losses are considered worthy of response, and whose suffering is expected to remain invisible. When a community is repeatedly pushed to the margins, their grief can be pushed there too. So if we are serious about healing institutions, have to do more than tell people to seek help. They have to examine whether they have created conditions where people can actually receive care without being dismissed or stereotyped, rushed, or forced to explain why their pain matters. Permission is not only something individuals need to reclaim. Permission is also something communities and systems need to practice. That means making room for history, making room for mistrust, making room for anger, making room for grief under the anger, making room for people to say this system has hurt us without immediately becoming defensive. Because until institutions are willing to acknowledge the ways they have contributed to silence, they may continue asking communities to heal inside environments that are still causing harm. And that is why connection cannot come next without this conversation first, right? So before we talk about belonging, we have to Ask whether the spaces people are being invited into have actually become safe enough to belong in them. Once grief has been acknowledged and space has been made for it, the next question is what helps people move from isolation toward connection? Because grief does not only need permission, but it needs relationship. It needs somewhere to be held beyond the individual person. Dr. Vivek Murthy describes connection in 3 dimensions, right? So intimate connection, relational connection, and collective connection. And that framework is useful here because BIPOC grief often exists across all 3. There is the private grief carried within close relationships. There is the grief shared among families, friends, and social circles. And then there is the grief that belongs to a wider culture, spiritual, and communal story. That wider connection matters because grief can become more isolating when people believe no one else understands the history behind what they are carrying. A person may know what happened in their own life, but there can also be a larger story around it, right? So family history, community memory, culture loss, repeated experiences of being pushed aside or overlooked. And connection helps place personal grief within that larger context without reducing the person to the history. Now, for BIPOC communities, collective connection can also become a source of restoration. It can reconnect people to culture, faith, family memory, story, and shared meaning. It can also remind people that they come from more than what happened to them. Their identity is larger than the wound. Their community is larger than the loss. Their story includes grief, but it also includes belonging. And that is important because loneliness often tells people they are alone in what they are carrying. But connection interrupts that message. And it says that even if no one else can feel the grief exactly as you do not have to carry it without companionship. And the companionship does not always require a formal program or professional setting. Sometimes what matters most is having a place where the truth can be spoken and received without judgment. A place where the person does not have to explain every part of their history before someone is willing to listen. It is a place where grief is allowed to be part of the conversation without becoming the whole identity of the person. This is also where community practices can matter. BIPOC communities have long used spiritual traditions, storytelling, music, gatherings, rituals, food, memory, and shared presence to hold both grief and joy. These practices do not erase the losses, but they can create a sense of continuity. They remind people that they are connected to something that existed before the current pain and that can continue beyond it. Now, connection, though, has to be safe. It cannot be forced. People who have spent years protecting themselves may need time before they can trust again. Communities that have experienced harm from institutions may not respond immediately simply because someone says, "We want to help you." Trust has to be demonstrated. Safety has to be experienced. And that means connection is not just about inviting people into a room. It is about what happens once they enter. Are they listened to? Are they respected? Is their history taken seriously? Are they allowed to tell the truth without being treated as difficult or angry? And can they bring their whole experience into that space? Those are the types of questions that matter, because connection without safety can become another form of exclusion. But when space is safe, connection can begin to change how grief is carried. The grief may still be present, but is no longer hidden in the same way. It now has a language, it has witness, and it has relationship. And sometimes that is what healing begins to look like. Not forgetting, not pretending the loss never happened, not asking people to move on, but changing the conditions around the grief so that no one has to carry it alone. That movement from silence to permission, and from permission to connection, begins to make room for something that many BIPOC communities have been denied for generations: the opportunity to mourn openly, to be witnessed fully, and to remain connected while doing it. When we talk about healing from unmourned grief, I do not want healing to sound like forgetting, erasing, or moving beyond the past as though it no longer matters. Healing is not the denial of what happened. It is the ability to acknowledge the truth of what happened without allowing silence to remain the only response. For BIPOC communities, healing has to include recognition. It has to include the recognition that some grief was never given a funeral, never given a public ritual, never given social permission, and sometimes never even given language. That recognition matters because people cannot mourn what they have been taught to minimize. Healing can begin when a family finally talks about what everyone has been carrying. It can begin when a community names a loss that has lived only in memory. It can begin when an institution stops defending itself long enough to listen to the people it has harmed. It can begin when grief is no longer treated as something inconvenient or private, but as something worthy of care and response. And I think this is where we have to move beyond the idea that healing is only an individual responsibility. We cannot keep asking people to heal while leaving the environments around them unchanged. We cannot tell communities to trust while refusing to acknowledge why trust was lost. We cannot encourage people to speak while continuing to punish them when they do. And we cannot ask people to come out of isolation while continuing to create spaces where they do not feel fully seen. Healing has to involve the person, but it also has to involve the family, the community, and sometimes the systems surrounding them. That does not mean every institution will repair every human. It does not mean that healing requires honesty. It requires a willingness to say that something happened, that it had consequences, and that those consequences still matter. There is also something important about being able to mourn without being reduced to grief. BIPOC communities are not only their pain. They are not only what was taken from them. They are not only histories of oppression, exclusion, or loss. Healing makes room for grief while also making room for joy, culture, creativity, faith, laughter, memory, and life. That is important because grief should be allowed to become part of the story without becoming the whole story. Okay, so the goal is not to remain forever inside the womb. The goal is to give the womb enough recognition that people no longer have to organize their entire lives around avoiding it. That is what permission begins to change. That is what connection begins to change. And that is what healing can begin to make possible. For some communities, healing may begin with public acknowledgement. For others, it may begin with family conversations, community rituals, culture restoration, spiritual practices, or simply being given the dignity of being listened to. The form may look different, but the movement is similar. Grief moves from being hidden to being named, from being carried alone to being witnessed, from being treated as weakness to being recognized and as part of the human response to loss. And perhaps one of the most important things healing can offer is the freedom to stop pretending that what happened did not matter. Because it did matter. The loss mattered, the people mattered, the history mattered, the grief mattered. And when we finally acknowledge that, we make room for something that silence could never offer us. We make room to mourn. As we come toward the close of this conversation, I want to return to the idea of witness, because so much of unmourned grief has lived without it. People have carried pain that was never acknowledged, never given language, and never met with the kind of presence that says, I see what happened and I recognize what it cost. For BIPOC communities, witness matters because so many experiences have been documented without being emotionally recognized. History may record the event. Policy may name the disparity, research may show the impact, but people still need someone to acknowledge the human cost. Facts can tell us what happened. Witness helps us understand that what happened affected real people, real families, and real communities. Witness also asks something of those who are listening. It asks us not to rush towards solutions. It asks us not to minimize pain because it makes us uncomfortable. It asks us not to turn someone else's grief into a debate. Sometimes the most faithful, humane response is simply to just stay present long enough for the truth to be spoken. And that kind of presence can be very much powerful because it pushes back against the message that some grief belongs in the margins. It says that this grief deserves space too. This story deserves to be heard too. This loss deserves to be acknowledged too. I think that is one of the responsibilities we carry in families and communities and churches, healthcare and organizations, and in public life. We have to become better witnesses. We have to learn how to hear pain without immediately explaining it away. And we have to learn how to recognize grief even when it does not arrive in the form we expect. For those of us who serve others, this means creating space where people do not have to prove that their grief is legitimate before they receive care. It means recognizing that some people are carrying personal loss and communal loss at the same time. It also means remembering that what looks like anger, withdrawal, mistrust, or silence may have a history behind it that deserves attention. And for those who are carrying unmourned grief themselves, witness can begin with one honest acknowledgement. Something happened, something was lost, and it mattered. Sometimes that is where the story begins to change, not because the past disappeared, but because the silence around it finally becomes or begins to break. Some people, whether they felt seen, people remember whether they felt seen. They remember whether their grief was honored. They remember whether their pain was handled with care. They remember whether they were giving room to breathe, to speak, to remember, or mourn. So maybe the invitation for this episode is simple. Listen more carefully. Make room intentionally. Recognize grief even when it has been hidden beneath survival, and
when someone finally tells the story they were never given permission to tell, don't rush them. Do not correct them. Do not move them toward a conclusion they are not ready for, but simply witness them. Because sometimes healing begins when someone realizes they no longer have to carry the whole story alone.
Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I want to invite you to sit with it just a little bit longer. Notice what came up, notice what feels heavy and what feels clear, and know that there is no rush to resolve any of it. You can also read the companion blog to this episode found on my website at www.drtammyisaac.com along with the show notes. If this conversation was helpful, you are welcome to share it with someone who may need it or leave a review so others can find their way here. And join me next Monday for a new episode of the Permission to Breathe podcast. And as always, take care of yourself gently. And until next time, give yourself permission to breathe.